to Liberty Unlocked. I'm Don Watkins. All right, before we start today's show, a special announcement. I'm very excited. My family and I recently moved to Michigan, and we finally found a really great apartment downtown that we're going to rent. And there, I'm going to have the opportunity to build a recording studio so that we can really up the quality of the sound and the audio for all the content I'm creating. I think that it'll make the experience much better for you, and I think it will help grow the show and grow its impact. What I need from you is either right now or after the show. In fact, do it right now. Go to donswriting.com/studio and you can help support my efforts to create something that's outrageously good. And as you'll see there's different rewards that I think are pretty fun. Everything from a signed copy of one of my books to having me fly out to your city for dinner. So definitely go to donswriting.com/studio, and I really appreciate the support. You guys are helping make the show and helping make all of my content much better. On to today's program. My guest is one of my best friends, Jeremiah Cobra. It's an interesting discussion that veers a lot from the major topics we cover, but I think that's part of what makes it fun. Jeremiah recently wrote a novel, and then he shot his cousin, that is astoundingly good. So we talk a lot about art, a lot about literature, a lot about creativity. We delve into what it takes to rise out of really disadvantaged starting points. And there's a lot of other stuff, whether it's everything from what it was like for Jeremiah to first encounter the objectivist movement when he moved to Southern California, which is where I met him, all the way to the state of race relations in America. So I hope you enjoy it. And remember, the best way to support the show is to get in the newsletter at donswriting.com. And once more, go to donswriting.com/studio and help me support the efforts to make this the highest quality program that it can be. All right, now on to the conversation with Jeremiah Cobra.
Well, awesome. Good to talk to you. I haven't talked to you face to face, such as it is, for a long time, not since I left California. I was trying to remember, though, the first time that we met, because I distinctly remember the first time I heard your name, which was I was in our mutual friend Lisa Van Dam's kitchen, and she was talking excitedly about this new prospective employee that she was hoping was going to move from Japan to come teach in the States. But I don't actually remember when it was you arrived and started working at Lisa's school. What year is that?
That was 2013, August 2013. I'm great with all the dates in my life. I don't know about like other dates, but I pinpoint everything.
I'm not. I can only relate dates to years that my books came out or my children were born. Everything else is a blur. And yeah, so you were living in Japan and came to teach grammar, and anything else at Lisa's school?
Well, I teach writing, and I taught literature this year for the first time. I really enjoyed that, so I'd love another opportunity to do that. But primarily it was grammar, but I taught grammar and writing as soon as I got here.
So one thing, and if people aren't familiar, and if you're in the Southern California area, Lisa Van Dam's school, Van Dam Academy, I highly recommend looking into. It's a private school that goes up through middle school, and my wife worked there for a while, and I saw just a transformation in so many kids that was amazing. And I told Lisa the first time I ever saw her school what I thought was profound, which was, I feel good and bad. Good because this is amazing to see, and bad because I didn't get it. And it turns out that's like a very common reaction. But one thing I was curious about was, so
I remember when I saw you, by the way. I don't mean
when was that?
It was at one of the. It was at one of the recitals or something like that. But I saw you came to the school with your wife, with Kate. I see your wife. I knew Kate before I knew you. And I just remember kind of being that first few months being here. It was just a weird.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about.
It was a starstruck feeling.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about, because I'm not going to steal your thunder and telling your story totally, but one thing I wanted to talk about is, so you discover Ayn Rand when you're on the flight over to Japan, right? Isn't that right? I'm misremembering that.
No, well, no, I didn't read Ayn Rand until I'd been in Japan for several years, for a few
Okay.
years. I'm like, I want to say I'm like Neo, but I feel like that sounds pretentious and people get the wrong impression. Like, you know how in the Matrix, everyone has to kind of be pulled out when they're young or whatever.
Right.
I was like, I was old. I was 24, I think, 25.
Yeah. I mean,
Like
you
everyone
had,
else I meet, they're like, oh, I got her in high school. My dad introduced. Yeah, I read it in 24 at the age of 20. I started reading Ayn Rand right when Obama became a viable candidate. So I don't know if
okay.
you want that whole story, but I can
Well,
definitely recount
maybe,
it. But it was definitely after I'd been in Japan for a few years.
so one thing I was curious about, so, I mean, you did all the learning on your own and,
Hmm.
weren't kind of involved in the circles. And then suddenly, you land at Lisa Van Dam's school in the midst of like the Ayn Rand Institute and probably like, most of the most well-known objectivists in the country. And I'm really curious as to just what your initial impressions were. Because one thing I've been thinking about just generally a lot is the movement. And one thing that's, one piece of that is getting sort of people's initial impressions. And you had a very unique one in that, like, the first impressions you got were not necessarily from a bunch of college kids who had just read The Virtue of Selfishness and didn't know what they were
Hmm.
talking about. You got exposed to like a lot, including a lot of really high caliber people at the same time. And I've never,
Um,
I don't know anybody else who had that.
yeah, that's interesting. So you just want to know like my perspective on what that was like,
Yeah.
because it was interesting. I definitely, I definitely found Ayn Rand's work intriguing on my own. No one pointed me in that direction. I was looking up books on capitalism because I was, at 24, I was hearing a lot about it and election and everything, and I knew I didn't know really what it was. I know a lot of people feel like they know what capitalism is, and they really don't. Certainly, I can't almost speak for everybody. I certainly knew I had a very cloudy understanding of what it was. So I was just looking for books, and I found Ayn Rand's work. And when I came out here, it was a really interesting uh, mix of objectivists to be put into, because when I came to Van Dam Academy, I definitely met prominent objectivists very quickly. Like I met you, I met Alex Epstein. He's one of the first people, and obviously I met Lisa. But then, not all the teachers at Van Dam are objectivists. So, um, and Kate as well. But like, I just felt relative to objectivists I would meet outside of the ones at our school. Um, it just felt like I was meeting normal people, if that makes any sense. So, um, and I'll say that relative to the people I would meet outside of the circle, because I would meet a lot of objectivists that had they felt very dogmatic to me.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it, like it was almost like meeting very religious people. It felt like going to a church for the first time or something like that. Like I remember what that feeling was in church. And I grew up in the church. I grew up in very strict apostolic church uh, back east in Connecticut. And it kind of felt a little like that. So yeah, I just really remember, and you can help me clarify the question, but I really just remember meeting these dynamic people who were doing dynamic things. Meeting Lisa first and meeting the school and seeing the school that she was doing. I don't know how much I would have been like, oh, I'm meeting an objectivist right now. It was just, I'm meeting the woman that's running the school that I've been really wanting to teach at for the past few years.
Yeah. I mean, the part of why I'm so big on encouraging, particularly people who I think are really good, to do more stuff online and
Mm-hmm.
to just create more content, is because I think often people's first introduction to objectivism is the people who give you the experience of, I'm arriving at church and they're like,
Mm-hmm.
looking at me, do I check all the boxes?
Right.
And it's a completely different experience when you meet the people who are kind of the highest caliber, because like, first of all, we're not that interested in whether you're an objectivist. We're interested if you're interesting. And,
That's what it felt like to meet you, to meet Alex, to meet Lisa. So those are and Kate as well. If you four were the first objectivists I ever met, and yeah, it was. When I talked to Lisa, we talked about school and education. I talked to Alex. He was really interested in just really what I was about. I'd contributed. He was trying to get, when I was in Japan, he was in the middle of really kind of starting CIP. And I think he was trying to get a debate funded. And I was really excited to see him get that debate done. So we kind of connected on that. What did we talk about? I feel like we talked about like that first conversation was just motivation and what motivates you to do well in your job and things like that. I don't think we talk about objectivism or Ayn Rand at all. I still don't think I've talked to Alex about objectivism at all. I don't. And same thing with Lisa. I mean, I've spoken with her on certain things that we agree on, and probably a couple of things that we disagree on. And I think because we've both read so much of the work and so much of our educational work is influenced by it, you kind of touch on different topics in that field, but we never had a when did you read Ayn Rand conversation. So
yeah, I find that so interesting. So I want to give people some sort of context. So one of the things I'm really excited to talk to you about, and so like allegedly the purpose of this podcast is like discussions about liberty, but the truth is that it's all a facade for my indulgence to have interesting conversations. And I've been on the edge of my seat to talk to you about a novel or novelette, I don't know what you called, that you just wrote, a book that you wrote in a few weeks during COVID and put out, and I got it. I was excited about it, but I was in the process of moving and kind of rearranging my career. And so it wasn't until 4th of July that I got to sit down and actually read it in one setting. And like it lived up to my expectations, which were already insanely high, because I've read your writing.
That's what I said. That means a lot, because I think that's the earliest thing I remember about you. I don't know why your expectations are so high of me, but I appreciate it, man. Like, I love you, man.
Well, so for people who don't know, I have a novel coming out in early 2021, and I had written fiction in my early 20s, just playing around, but I hadn't written in years. And one day you came over to my house, Lisa was there, Kate was there, and maybe a few other of our friends, and you read selections from an earlier novel you were working on. And I just remember that feeling of like, oh my God, like that's somebody I know writing real like literature. And that really was the thing that put the bug in me. I was like, I wonder if I could do that. And that I didn't start right away, but that was the thing that started getting me sort of pondering and eventually putting my pen to paper. And so
now I have high expectations of you, man. The book is not good. People are gonna blame me. No, I'm just messing with you. I love the work that you've already done, so I'm excited to see it come. I didn't realize it was early 2021. So,
but for people who don't know, I think this is some context to even getting to understand sort of what your latest book is about. Like, you definitely represent sort of like a modern, in my mind, like self-made man sort of story. And I'll leave it to you how much depth you want to go into it. But in particular, I think it's one of the things I teach in communication is this idea of personalization, which is that you don't want to just talk about ideas in the abstract. You want to talk about how they're impacting real people. But that's just as important, even for being a thinker, is you should try to personalize. And so one of the things that I think about when I write in the regulatory welfare state and how it impacts people is I have in my mind, like, what would this have done to a young Jeremiah who, like, had to work really hard to make something of himself. So, I mean, just a little bit sort of like, where you started from, getting to this point in life so that people have some context. So for the podcast listeners, you'll see why this is relevant later, but Jeremiah is Black. He grew up in like not the greatest part of Connecticut, which people don't, if they're not from Connecticut stands for like the sexy part of, place above New York, but it
Yeah,
has,
that's what
it
everyone
has some
thinks.
streets. So you take it from there.
There's some dark parts of Hartford. Oh man, that's where to begin. So Hartford definitely has some rough. I mean, Connecticut definitely has some rough areas, and Hartford, a lot of Hartford, can be pretty rough. But the thing about Hartford, in particular, of some of the rougher areas, is that there are places you can go to that are very beautiful, and you don't really know what's going on there because it looks so quaint. Like I could take you, and anybody who's listening to this who's ever been to Hartford or grew up in Hartford, uh, I could take you down Blue Hills Avenue, which sounds like a beautiful place. Oh, this is Blue Hills Avenue, and if generally speaking, if we drove down it, it would look very nice, but at nighttime it can be pretty rough. Um, so yeah, Hartford, Connecticut has some rough areas. I experienced some of the worst that Hartford has to offer, and then definitely some of the better things that Hartford has to offer. And I definitely think, as an adult thinking back on it, Hartford is a beautiful city, or a beautiful little city. Every time I go back, it strikes me just how small Hartford is. But they've been improving, and it's very different in many respects. But so much more to appreciate now that I'm an educated adult than when I was there. But prior to going into foster care, and I did grow up in foster care. So prior to going into foster care, my childhood was pretty rough. It wasn't, um, yeah. I'll just state it like that. It was pretty rough. We were homeless at one point, and so there are definitely parts of Hartford that I lived in, or I've been in a lot of those homeless shelters, and then I think I revisited some of those homeless shelters once, later in my teenage years. But so I've seen that part of Hartford. Um, I I think once I was in a foster home, so I think the foster home that I lived in, I was still in Hartford. I think that was a nicer part of Hartford. Still, things could go down there, and I think, uh, and various, like, trouble was up the street. Like, if it wasn't on my street, it was kind of up the street or three
Right.
streets over. Um, there was one summer, I remember we had, I think we ended up ranking number 4 or 5 in the country for violent crimes or murders or something like that. And I remember that particular summer. Like, it was pretty rough. And I think the worst part of it is it was like young children that were involved in it. There were shootings that were going on, and it was like middle school kids and high school kids that were involved in that kind of thing. So that was pretty rough. But again, I think by the time I became a teenager, I'd kind of learned how to find where I was supposed to be, and find the right kind of people to be around, that kind of kept me away from that kind of thing. And the goal was to be away from that, from me, from a very early age. I wasn't, I'm not a thug, I'm not a gangster. I didn't grow up in the street. I just know where it is. Um,
Well, and one
so
thing that always impressed me, like, is because there's always a question, well, how does one, rise above circumstances? And one anecdote I remember you telling me was like, whatever job you had, the idea
mhm.
wasn't like do the job, get a paycheck, but do the job the best it could be done. And I forget if your example was like washing dishes or something like that,
Yeah.
but just
Uh,
this commitment to really like working the hell out of whatever work you were doing.
and is the question, where'd that come from? Because
Well,
I
I'd be
don't.
curious to where it come from, but even just like, you know, what role you think that played in, your overall ability. Cause I mean, clearly what really did it was, I mean, you were like, you learned, like you were a learner who kind of got yourself out by education.
Hmm.
And but I think you know, it's not just sitting in a classroom, it's having an attitude towards your life of ambition, whether it's education or even like earning a dollar.
Yeah, I would like to, I think I would say that I was very good at school. So that was, I guess, a big part of it. I definitely did well in school. Um, I also think I had some pretty good teachers that kind of instilled that in me. So to just speak to that, yes, there was always a very strong impetus in me towards doing the best that I could at whatever it was. Um, I'm not exactly sure where that message came from. I know it was it was me kind of absorbing. Uh, if I were to say, like, I experienced the good things of Hartford and the bad things of Hartford, there were definitely the good parts of Hartford, the good people that I came up around. I will never forget any of my elementary school teachers when I was living in Hartford. I don't even know if they're still with us. But I had a fifth grade teacher who was very strict. Um, I had a fifth grade teacher who was very strict. Uh, she kind of had if you don't greet her the right way, like you had to say good morning and good afternoon. So you had to be very polite to her. You had to say excuse me when you walked by her, and she would tear you to pieces if you did. And I don't know why I liked that, but I thought, yeah, that's it. And I'm still like that. Like I'll be in a grocery store and if somebody walks by me and doesn't say excuse me, like Mrs. Clater's voice rings in my head. What is wrong with you? Who raised you? So I feel like it was a combination just of a lot of people kind of. Um, I think a lot of the teachers in Hartford in those schools are trying to push or at least get that message into you that if you want better, you can get there if you work hard and if you do the right things. And I don't know how many people received that message, but it was definitely something that I received and took very seriously. So whether it came to school or like you stated earlier, I had several jobs that were for the most. I mean, I guess people would consider them menial jobs, but uh, two things thrilled me about that. One, I was working and making money for myself. I've been working since I was 13, by the way. So it's like I've always had a job since I was
Right.
13, and the whole job. I mean, the whole idea was always. I mean, first there was an immense amount of pride in that I was making my own money. Like I started buying my own groceries as early as possible. So it was just like, yeah, I can do this. I don't need anybody to do this for me. But then it was also, I think I just caught on very early that if I do the best job that I'm capable of, that's going to be rewarded. And it generally was. My first job when I was 13 was actually a data entry job. So this is another one of those things. They had was the Urban League of Greater Hartford. They had a program where they would help young children who wanted to work find jobs and find the permits or whatever and get those jobs. And so the first job was this data entry position. And one of the first thoughts I really kind of had was, man, they have me doing the work that they don't want to do. But the other, like almost immediately after that, I thought, yeah, I'm 13. I think I was making like $10 an hour or something like that. Uh, and yeah, this is fine. Like I'll do this and I can do it. And then as I started getting into the work, it was just like, I can do this better. Like they would tell me how to do something, and I'm like, there are at least 2 or 3 better ways to do this, so that one, I can finish faster, and two, it would just work out better for them. So I ended up working out like this filing system that uh, when I showed it to them, they go, "Oh my god!" That was one of the first. That was definitely the first experience I had as an employed person, knowing that my talent and the extent to which I wanted to work hard would get me farther along. They wanted to hire me the next year. And then once I became 16, once I turned 16, then I could do whatever I want. I've literally done everything.
Everything.
I don't,
I
yeah.
want to, and the reason I wanted to go into your background some is, and I hope listeners don't find it gratuitous. I hope you don't. The reason I wanted to give them this context is because I wanted you. I think it's relevant to understanding your art. But in particular, I asked you to do me a favor, which is I want you to read a poem that you wrote. It's one of my all-time favorites. It's been since I first heard it, and I saw you deliver it. You did a poetry reading and art show evening when we were still in California a few years back. And I just remember watching you read this one was, it sticks out in my mind as like one of those memories that you can't, like, it's indelible. But I think part of it was just knowing something about you added a lot to it. But
All right, well,
feel free to set it up any way you want.
Yeah, so I can set it up. So there are a few things going on in the poem that I feel like warrants an explanation for how I got to writing the poems. But so first, it's important to I guess know about me that before I grew up in a foster home, things were pretty rough. Again, we were homeless at a point, and I think we were living in and out of these kind of motels or whatever. Just kind of get in a room and be like one room, and me, my parents, and like three of my sisters were all just like in one room. And I won't get into detail because they're pretty rough. And I guess the poem, I guess, will kind of set the scene or the tone of it. But I saw, especially when we ended up living in this homeless shelter, there was some rough stuff to see in there. And to see it at 6, I think I was 5 or 6, was in retrospect, like, man, no 6-year-old should have to see that. Not in any particularly I guess unsettling way, just the notion that I guess as a teacher, every time I look at my students and see where they get to start, and especially our students at our school, I'm almost elated to just know that they have no idea what I saw by the time I was 6 or 7 years old. They shouldn't have to. There's nothing about that like makes you like you have to see it in order to become what you're going to become or become a greater person. It's like it's one thing, but I guess there's certain things you can, if you can use it to make you stronger, I guess you can say that, but not everybody does, and understandably so, not everyone does. So yeah, being homeless and then living living on welfare and living check to check was a pretty rough period. And then there was the foster home, which had living in a foster home. The one foster home that I did live in for a number of years was not. She was a very kind woman, and we were in a much better living situation than we were prior to getting to her. But I think then just the living in a foster home has its own emotional toll. And like I said, I think, again, I was kind of fortunate in that I've heard some horror stories about growing up in foster care. And I've got my stories, but they're not nearly as bad as some stories that I've heard. So there's that. And I think the one thing that always kind of kept me, it didn't occur to me that hard work was the common element in my ability to succeed or get into the places that I needed to go. It didn't occur to me that hard work was that until I'd read Ayn Rand. I don't remember off the top of my head which essays did the trick, but there were a few essays that I read, and like the light went on. It was just like, that's what I've been doing. Like implicitly, I worked hard, and implicitly, I wanted to do the best that I could. And and stand out as someone who didn't just kind of I guess mosey along, so to speak, or take work for granted, or just not do the work at all. So that came later. Prior to that, though, I just found school to be kind of just like a safe haven. Just I love going to school just because I could be not the child who was homeless, and I think being in school and becoming proficient at the being able to learning to read, and then I think fostering a love for reading in general was one of the more explicit things I think that helped me um, find the paths that I wanted to go down in order to be successful. And so the poem that I think you're referring to, the tragedy, the triumph poem that we talked about earlier, it's kind of an ode to that.
And how old were you when you wrote it? I mean, I think didn't this one you kind of played with for years, right?
Yeah, this one, man, how old was I? I mean, I played with it for years, but I mean, I'm 37 now, going on 38. So I guess it's been about 8 or 9 years now since I started, and it has definitely gone through many drafts. But it actually started off as a rap song. I could use this condenser mic that I'm not using. It's just sitting over here now. There's a song. I'll send it to you later. I still have it. It's pretty good. I mean, the poem's pretty good. So
sure.
So should I go ahead and read it now?
Yeah, whenever you're ready.
All right. This is interesting. Get into the mood. I was sleeping on pissy mattresses, mama weeping and asking if God was meaning to cast us among the thieving and blasphemous. Daddy gave us beatings, the ashes mixed with the bleeding. The lashes gave me a reason to bask among all the demons, till at last I could not fathom another ass whooping, nor be trapped in the perpetual baptism. So I'm never giving in, fighting until my ending is better than my beginning, because that's the meaning of living. Yeah, daddy, he beat the children, and mama, she kept the kitchen, but all her preaching and singing, they weren't healing his sickness, they were concealing his wickedness. Drunken drug addictions were hidden by benedictions. I'm more than a living witness, a victim from birth conflicted, but my conviction was not to be afflicted by the sickness I lived with. So I'm never giving in, fighting until my ending is better than my beginning, because that's the meaning of living. So next were the homeless shelters. The second story of hell is the floor where all of the skeletons slept with beggars and felons. And yet the story gets better when words became my medicine. I learned my letters and a whole heaven lay out ahead of them. I could see past the pain and wrath. I aimed to last till flames were ash when it rained at last. So I'm never giving in, fighting until my ending is better than my beginning, because that's the meaning of living. I sojourned the path of Douglas, resolve of Harriet Tubman. I ventured far from the gutters where crimes are often unpunished. I earned my pride with prejudice, disregarding the devils and houses of Seven Gables for fables of the benevolent. I read both Ralphs, Ralph Ellison and Waldo Emerson. Hugo Dumas and Clemens helped raise a Yank from Connecticut, and I'm never giving and fighting until my ending is better than my beginning, because that's the meaning of living. The prologue I did not draft, but I'll write the remaining chapters with happily ever afters and passionate cries and laughters. But one day I imagine the masterpiece will be crafted. I'll sit among all the masses and have them ask me what happened. They'll say, you made it from birth, afflicted to be a victim. How'd you eschew the script and preserve all your convictions? I'll say, by never giving in, fighting until my ending was better than my beginning, because that's the meaning of living.
Man, I just I love that so much.
I'm glad. That's in this book. That's a different book.
Yeah, so everybody can get that on Why don't you give it the website? It's on Amazon too. Beauty and Perspective by Jeremiah Cobra. But what's your website URL?
www.jeremiahcobra.com.
Oh, there you go.
First and last name.com. And you can navigate. It's actually on the first page. You can just scroll down to the book. If you click on the book, it'll direct you to a page with all of the different places. You can get on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, IndieBound, wherever.
So I want to turn to, now that people have a sense of your writing, albeit poetry, I do want to turn to the book. So take me to like how this germinates and becomes, and then he shot his cousin. It's just the title of the book.
Wait, how this germinates, like how this book germinates?
How the new one.
Just how I created it. Man, am I allowed to say I love the entire process? Like I almost feel kind of arrogant. This is a really good. I actually shared this with a few. I gave my barber a copy, and he read it, and he and his wife read it, and they're like, they can't stop talking about it, which is like, all right, man. Like I'm just really excited about this book. The way it came about. First of all, I wrote the first draft in a weekend, and then I finished writing the entire book and editing and all of that. The total of it was a month, from about April 8th to May 7th. And so what happened was, I actually, so the novel that I read that you had heard way back when you were talking about, I'd come to your house, and Lisa and everyone was there, and I read from a book. That book is done. It's been done for about a year now, and my goal was to put it out this year. And it was supposed to come out in June. It would have come out about a week ago if we hadn't all been locked in our houses. So that was the goal. Around March and April, I wanted to start, getting press for it and starting to start marketing and all of that. And I was going to go about that process, kind of in a freestyle way. I'm still learning how to, walk the self-published path. And I was going to do it with that book, but then we were locked in our houses. I'm like I spent so many years doing this book, I don't want to put it out the wrong way, so let me hold off on that. But in the meantime, I had already started redoing my Instagram page, and I wanted only work. I have it tiled so that it's only work that I've done, and it was clips or like passages from this book, and then I wanted to do paintings, even though I don't know a whole lot about, I'm not a painter. I can paint. I don't really know how to explain it. I'd never done watercolor before, and because we were locked in our houses, we had all the free time in the world. I went to Target because that was the only place I was allowed to go, and they had watercolor paints in there. So I said, hey, I'm not doing anything. And I actually had bought these watercolor pads like 2 years ago that I'd never used. I'm like, you know what, let's use them. And so I got my paints and my brushes for a total of about $10 from Target. And then I started looking on YouTube of how to use them. And I came up with some pretty good work. I came up with stuff that was good enough that people actually kind of wanted to buy it. And I didn't see that one coming. I was just going to kind of play around with it.
Yeah.
And then one of the YouTube videos, I can't remember the guy's name, but I actually absolutely would love to give him some kind of shout out if I could in some way later. But he had this one lesson on value. And anybody who's listening to this who knows anything about art knows, well, probably know one, I know very little about what I'm talking about. Also, what part of it does make sense of yeah, of course that makes sense. But these are all new concepts to me. So the concept of value is making sure that the light areas of a painting are presented the right way, and the dark areas of it, whatever you're trying to portray, whatever picture you're trying to portray, the lights need to be accurate, the darks need to be accurate. And so he had this one lesson in which he stated that color is not important as long as you get the value correct. You can paint any picture in any color as long as you get the values correct. And so he had this challenge where you take a portrait, any portrait. He had simpler portraits. There are definitely more difficult portraits you can choose. And I probably chose a more difficult portrait than I ought to have chosen. But the challenge is to take that portrait and paint it in one color. But what the way you present values is to make sure you're using the adequate amount of water in your brush to make that color lighter or darker. And I don't have that.
As somebody who cannot draw a circle, I am. This is it's fascinating, but it's so intimidating right now that like I'm nervous to walk by a watercolor aisle at Target.
And I heard watercolor is really hard to use. It is hard to use, but I don't have a real context for what it's hard to use relative to, because I took one art class in high school, and it was an AP art class, and that was because because of my tumultuous upbringing, I had dropped out of school for a year. I don't know how many people know that about me, but I dropped out of school, and then when I went back, I was kind of like this prodigal son figure, which is great because usually teachers hate when a child drops out and then they come back. So it's like, it's just back. But they really were in my corner. And the goal was, I ended up graduating on time, which meant I graduated in 3 years. But the goal was like, how do we make the transcript look good, even though he's missing that sophomore year? So they were like, well, what can you do? I was like, I'm pretty good with a pen and pencil. Let me take AP art. And they were like, sure. I didn't have like a portfolio. So that's the only art class I've ever taken. And I guess I did some decent stuff in there, but again, I would hardly call myself a studied artist. And so I've heard watercolor can really be challenging, at first it was the goal. I took this self-portrait, actually, it's on the back of this painting. And so I painted this first. Now, I don't have the original because I gave it away in a promotional stunt to sell books, but I have a high quality photo of it somewhere, but I did this painting. It's a self-portrait. And at first it was coming across terribly, but then suddenly I started to understand what he was saying, and I started to get the values right. And so that is all watercolor and black. And so I made this picture first.
And just for people who aren't seeing this right now, I mean, it's incredibly lifelike. It's stylized, right? Like, but it's incredibly lifelike and just black, like shades.
Right. I think I have a picture. Let's see here. I'll show you what it. Let's see here. This isn't the high quality one, but it gives you a better sense. All right, so that's what it looked like initially. And so I took that, and because I took the picture and put it on my iPad, I started playing around with the iPad in different fonts, and kind of came up with this book cover. So I was doing the Instagram, putting paintings and quotes on there. And so once I did this picture, I put this picture up there. That was April 8th. So then there was also, in that same time, I was trying to figure out things that were good that I had said. Like there weren't that much. I only had this book, and I definitely discovered that while I definitely think there are some very good things that I'm proud of about this book, it's not the most quotable in terms of Instagram, because you can't put too many words on an Instagram,
right?
Or an Instagram post, or apparently, from what I'm told, people will just gloss over it. So I was trying to come up with these very short, very contained clips. And so once I had run out of things from this book, I started going into these old pads from 2004. And this is 2004 me.
These are old aged journals. They're gorgeous looking.
Exactly. I was so sure that then that I was going to be a famous author, which I am not yet. But I was so sure that I'm like, dude, I need to put whatever I write in some gorgeous looking stuff, because when they find this, they're gonna know. This is Jeremiah back in the 21st century wrote some dope stuff. So this is what I wrote my journals in. I wrote this. This is filled with short stories, and the first thing I thought when I went through all of this is that, man, 21-year-old Jeremiah cannot write. There's some all right stuff in here, but there's some trash in here. And but there was this one clip that I ended up turning into a quote on Facebook. On Instagram rather, that inspired the story. So that's the short end, because I could keep going on.
What was the quote?
The quote. So I'll explain very briefly what inspired the quote. I was going through those pads, and I saw this short. It wasn't even a story. It was like a sketch. If you're an artist, you sketch things. You have your sketch pads, you sketch things. And so as a writer, I would just kind of start scenes. I wouldn't finish them. I wouldn't necessarily turn them into stories. I would just kind of play around with like this, try to make this line of dialogue, or try to set this scene, or try to set a mood or something like that. And so really, to that extent, maybe there's a lot more valuable stuff in those pads than I'm like giving myself credit for.
Apparently, if you got this book out of it,
there's a lot of bad stuff. So this is what happened. So I thought there was like 1.5 pages of this scene, this really dark scene, because 21-year-old Jeremiah was also very dark. He hadn't read Ayn Rand yet, so he was really dark, and he'd been through some stuff, so he was really dark. So. Right.
I had been through nothing, and I was quite dark at that age. So
no, what's so funny? We can talk about this maybe another time, or I could just have a conversation later. But it was weird. I can relate to this character so much, obviously, because I kind of made the character up, but that I've always, I think, been a very happy, certainly as a kid, I was a very happy kid, which threw a lot of my teachers off. None of my teachers knew what I was going through, because I was always such a happy kid. And I, for the most part, held on to that even when the worst things were going on. And so there was always this, I remember it becoming the most pronounced when I was about 15 or 16 years old, of thinking the world is awful. But is it that like, it was like, it's a weird pull out. I'd have to put some more thought into it to give it probably the proper metaphor, but it was this kind of wanting to think that the world was awful and all of the people in it were awful, just based on the experiences that I had, but also kind of telling myself, that's not it. You're like, you don't have to, like, it was almost like I knew I was trying to make the path to the dark side. And another part of me saying, not all people, not all of the world, not,
well, in that sense, so this, just to give people a little context, like, the book's not autobiographical in any strict sense, but it is, it's a, young man in foster care, teenager, who has this cousin, or person he thinks of as his cousin, even though they're not technically related. And really, it's somebody who has sort of a draw to real values, to piano, to, like, don't
give too much away.
I'm not.
Okay.
And yet there is surrounded by influences that are kind of more conditioned to the street and interested in the streets. And there's a little bit of a tug of war in his soul of, like, what is my life going to be about? And he can see the appeal of each side. And he's really taught by many of the people around him to suppress the best parts of him, and told that that's not what it means to be a man. That's not what it means to be a person who can get by in the world. And that's sort of the core dilemma he's facing in his life.
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, again, while I have that in commman with this protagonist, but obviously this is really not an autobiographical story.
You have shot very few cousins, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I've shot no cousins. But I do think that theme is a very universal one. I feel like a lot of people, especially these days, you could talk about specifically what's going on today, and you probably juxtapose it with what has gone on in the past. But I feel like a lot of people always kind of feel this pull And I think the decision to say that the universe is awful is a decision. And even if it may be a subconscious one, I feel like everyone kind of reaches a phase where they're going to decide, is the world a place for me, or is this a place to lament because it's not? And there are various things pulling them in one direction or the other. But I think it's a vital fork in the road that a lot of people, and usually in their teenage years, start to encounter. So there was definitely that. So yeah, my writing was dark. We said all that just to say that my writing was dark. And the piece in this notepad that I found was a very brief scene where there was a young woman. She could not move. She could open her eyes, but she could not move. And she was kind of looking around. She saw like the rain shimmering on the street, which is kind of how the book opens. And she was pretty sure she was dying, but she was not. Like she couldn't move. So she realizes she can't move her head, but her head is like stuck to this leather car. She's inside of a car. She realizes she's inside of a car. Her face is stuck to the seat. She can't move it off. She thinks she's dying. And then the way this scene closes is that she hears two familiar voices in the background say, "My dad's going to kill us. What should we do with the car and the body?" And then I cut out. And that's how it cuts out. And so I took that. And then there's this other clip about this other young girl who had this awful secret that she'd been holding on to since childhood. Again, it's not explained. This is not a story. It's just another clip in there. It's a young girl who had this awful secret, and the secret made her stutter. It gave her a speech impediment. And so I was just playing around with those two ideas and came up with the clip that's on Instagram, but has no story. It just said, perhaps his stutter had returned, or perhaps his tongue was burdened by the truth he buried in the silence between each syllable. And that line had no story. It was just, let's write that. That could be cool. I'm gonna put that on Instagram. And that was the first line. That's almost the last line in the book, but it's the first line that I wrote. And then I started playing around with it. I think initially when I wrote this on Instagram, I immediately thought I could do a story, and I can make this the book cover, this picture. I could turn this image into the book cover, and it could be about like maybe the secret is murder or something like that. And I could write a murder story, and I can call it "Let Us Not Speak of Murder," and that's why he stutters. And that was like the first step. And then I later decided that, and then he shot his cousin with. Those are both pretty good titles, right? "Let Us Not Speak of Murder" is a pretty good one, but that's not what I call it. That's the name of the first chapter of the book I decided on. And then he shot his cousin. Figured that would catch your eye, and that was it. I mean, there's, I in a weekend, I kind of got the idea to write the story from everything I just told you there. I knew it would be short enough. I didn't outline this book at all. I just wrote it. I wrote it. It all really just kind of came out of me. And then in the editing process, I had to kind of go back through and make sure things did follow and make sense and everything was connected. I felt like this was short enough that I could do that. And then I edited the book, which you're never supposed to do. So I edited, and I don't recommend anyone do that, but this was short enough, and I got enough of my own grammatical experience. And there were still errors. Like there were things I had to fix, like down to the wire right before it came out on June 1st. There's things in there. I was like, nope, I gotta, and things that I had a few friends picking out as well and saying, nope, you gotta fix that. So I wouldn't recommend it. But again, this was short enough that I could do it.
And I mean, I think I don't want to give any spoilers away. So the one thing I will just say is that, like, the characters are like so real and stick with you. Like even some of the minor characters, like I find myself thinking about, and like you never have the feeling of the author's hand in who these people are. And that's
right.
It's something I struggle with. And so it was a real a real achievement.
That is the there's so many high compliments. That's a really high compliment to get as a writer. And I hope that I hope that I get to be in a place where someone will tell me that, and I can just be like, yes, that's, of course, that is how you write. But I just figured out how to achieve that. Like with this book, I figured out how to achieve that, and it feels like that moment when you're riding a bicycle, when you're learning how to ride a bicycle, and you keep falling, and then suddenly you can ride the bicycle and it moves where you want it to go, and the wheel stays straight. It's like that moment of learning. I feel that I'm almost childlike giddy at being able to create those characters and knowing how I did it, being able to explain it, and knowing that I can replicate it in future stories. It's a really exciting experience as a writer.
So I did want to touch on, so going from the sublime to the, what's the word? I'm going blank on. Man, when you can't come up with a cliche and you're touting yourself as a writer. But in any case, what has been your whole reaction to the George Floyd protests, everything that's come out? First of all, have you had white friends coming up to you saying, I want to have a conversation about racism because I've been told that I must do that? And has it led to awkward scenarios? What's
it hasn't led to anything awkward. First of all, I definitely have, and I won't put anybody in the spot because I feel like it's a very reasonable. Is that not part of the goal of the movement in some way? It's a weird.
Well, it's both. It traps you because it says that this is what you should be doing, and then it makes you feel bad for doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's an interesting phenomenon as well. It's had two interesting effects to me. The first is that definitely white friends, white people in stores, strangers have come up to me in some way and either asked to, ask questions or wanted to have a conversation, or have been overly polite, which is like, I don't need that. It almost feels like they think I just got over a debilitating disease or something. It's like I am not. Like, it's weird in that, yes, we need things to be better. There are things that need to change, but also I am not helpless. Like they're coming to me as if I've been traumatized by being Black, and I've had a very good life. That's Black, or I've had a good life. I don't need you coming up to me. It's almost like sympathy for being Black. Don't sympathize. Don't pity me for being Black. See what we can. Let's clarify the conversation and see what we can do to fix the things that need to be fixed, but don't pity me on the way. I have a friend who stated that. Well, I won't go into it. The politeness is just be as unpolite or impolite rather as you've been to me before as a stranger. Don't do that. But I welcome the conversation, or like the kind of the questions of, or like the conversation starters, because I feel like, one, I do have a lot of things to say on the matter, and as far as education goes, and kind of understanding, where the whole police brutality conversation needs to start. I think there's a tremendous amount of American history that has kind of gone unstudied, so to speak. And
what do you have in mind there?
Well, one of the first things I posted as soon as everything kind of went down is, or particularly with the George Floyd thing, as soon as that kind of reached a fever pitch, one of the first things I posted was this link to, I think, a very good PBS special on Reconstruction. Because I feel like a lot of people don't know what Reconstruction was. And on the one hand, I think a lot of Black people don't really know a lot about that era as well, but I don't necessarily I think everyone should learn it, but I don't think from their perspective that's necessary for them to be able to express I've been pulled over and had very disrespectful encounters with the police, and feared for my life in front of a police officer. Like, you don't need to know Reconstruction to know that experience. But for people who haven't had that experience, they need to know that that's a very real feeling that Black people tend to typically have. I've had that feeling and experience, and I have two very specific stories that I could get into. And that relationship between the Black community and the police has that relationship. I mean, you could argue it goes back to slavery, just because you went from having government coerced slavery, government, it was illegal to be a Black person and walk the street.
Right.
Like, if I were walking the street in Virginia and I didn't have the right papers, you get arrested for that. You get arrested for it, and probably, if I wore a skate, like, it was illegal to be Black. It was, and then you could really make the real argument it's illegal to be Black. But after Reconstruction, there was, and I think especially in the South and various parts of America as well, there was a very strong movement of putting racist white people into the police department. Like, that was a very, from Reconstruction through Jim Crow, that was a very prominent way for racist white people to get back at the Black community. And it's documented. At one point it wasn't, they weren't even ashamed that they were doing it. Like, they were doing it very purposefully. And then you get to a point, 70s, 80s, 90s, and today, where now it's like, are they still doing that? And it's a little more hidden, but I honestly, without the notion that that's not happening today, I am not of the opinion that most, or even half or whatever, like, I feel like the vast majority of the police officers are heroic and are doing what they're supposed to be doing. But if you think that there isn't a racist cop, probably here in California, that's using his position in a that word escapes me, who's using their power to their advantage. And I think, you haven't paid attention to history, and the history between the Black community and the police department.
No, I think it's important that you're making this point, because I think there's a tendency by people who reject, this tear down capitalism, tear down individualism. There's a tendency to say, well, I don't want anything to do with those people, so I'm going to either deny or whitewash the problem and totally minimize it. And what I've tried to be big on is, first of all, this overall idea of we need to focus on what's right, not who's right. So you don't say, oh, is this going to align me with Black Lives Matter? Or is this going to align me with Trump? What's right? First, you figure that out. And then if you have to, quote, take sides, whether it's in the voting booth or somewhere else, then you can have that conversation. But first, we need to acknowledge what's going on. And so to hear you say that and not be anti-capitalist, and somebody who is also recognizes that this isn't the only problem that Black people face. There's also cultural problems in many of these communities that, that they face. I think it's refreshing that, and what needs to be more prominent in the conversation are people who don't fall into these preordained categories of how we're supposed to think about politics, race, policing, who are really just looking at it and don't have a dog in the tribal fight that's really at what we see on Twitter and in the newspapers.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, just from my end, that's been one of the harder, I won't call it a line, but I mean, yeah, because it's not a matter of, for me, it's hard to not pick sides, because you almost feel that pressure. You got to pick one side or the other. And as a Black man in America who's not, I mean, as an educated Black, like I know the period, I know the history. I won't sit here and say, oh, whatever Black people are thinking is completely imagined. I feel like some people go in that route, like there is no police brutality or whatever. But on the other hand, this notion that we can't have a debate about it, we can't have a discussion about it, I think is, I mean, dangerous just on the one hand, and counterproductive on the other. If we're trying to implement change, we need to have a discussion about what the change is and what the nature of it is, or like what you were saying before is the nature of the problem, what's actually wrong, and how to go about fixing it.
One thing I'll mention, I mentioned this to you. In fact, I've only really gotten clear on it recently.
Mhm.
Like it was not until I was quite old, like in high school, that race even became like an issue on my radar screen, because I had just always grown up around. I'm from a military family, like I was just around diverse people, and it was a real hard leap for me to get the psychology of how could like people even take this seriously. Like I knew in the abstract it had happened, like that there had been periods of enormous like legally enforced racism and slavery.
Mhm.
Um, but then said, okay, well, the ideal is being colorblind. And it was just during our friendship that I realized, well, I'm aware, like colorblind seemed to give this idea that you shouldn't even be aware that like a person is black, and you can't even say that, or you can't say that like white, like it seemed. And so it just instilled this guilt of like, well, I am aware. Does that make me a bad person? I realized like
Mhm.
that's not the right way to conceptualize it. What is it like? You can and should be aware like of like every fact of reality, but it's
Mhm.
what's the meaning you're ascribing to it. And I didn't
Mhm.
ascribe any meaning to it. And so that was the
Mhm.
key thing, is that like we should be aware of facts and aware of their meaning and their moral meaning. And there's no moral, intellectual, like social meaning in skin color. And that's where, and that's why I'm so angry with when I say Black Lives Matter, I'm meaning the organization, the ideology, not people who
Mhm.
are making this point that they're not being protected from police
Right.
brutality.
Well, that's
They're
the tricky. Go ahead.
Well,
No,
what I was
I'm
going to say is what makes me so angry about it is that they're presenting as the alternative this, we should just only be aware, and we should ascribe total meaning to those differences.
well, that's so one of the probably more unfortunate things would be that unless some very tremendous work is done over the next few months, probably, the Black Lives Matter as a movement, Black Lives Matter as a movement, and Black Lives Matter as an organization will forever be kind of intertwined, and people will do very little uh, of the necessary intellectual work to separate those two things. And it is I think unfortunate, because there again you have a very important thing that needs to be addressed, and very important things rather that need to be addressed, and things that need to be fixed, and a relationship between um, the police department, the government, and the Black community that needs to be healed. And then you also have, as the the loudest voice on that matter, it's almost like in order to do that we've got to burn things down, or in order to do that we've got to be anti-capitalist. There are several things that I disagree with regard to the Black Lives Matter organization. And I think what's potentially dangerous about that is people look at, if if you are pro-capitalist and you hear that the Black Lives Matter as like the organization is Marxist, now you throw out all of their arguments. Like they're not going to
Mhm.
just say, "Well, there's still an issue that needs to be addressed." Now we're going to, like, the fact that we are grouping things into my side or your side or whatever is putting us in a position as a country to not address the actual issue that needs to be addressed. Just because people are looking at it like that whole side needs to be uh, done away with, or even just as a Black man saying I'm not pro-Marxist. Like I hope we're not in a place where I can say I'm pro-capitalist as a Black American and still be considered someone who wants to change in the Black community. Like I hope we're not that far gone where in order to be Black now I've got to be pro-socialist and pro-Black, pro-communist, because first of all,
Hell no.
I can't even. I mean, I just can't even imagine which black people would be on board. Like, you don't have. I wrote this as a tweet and I deleted it because I felt like it needed more context. But you don't get Jay-Z, LeBron, Michael Jordan, Oprah, who's the guy, Bob Johnson, the guy that's fun to be like all of the. You don't get black billionaires and millionaires in socialism. Period. You don't. You won't. Like, and the other thing about it is when or communism for that matter is the same thing. And when let's say we implement or somehow end up getting into a position where the Black Lives Matter movement gains traction and we start going in the Marxist direction, if you think they're not going to go for Jay-Z and Beyonce, you're out of your mind. Like, they're going for them first. How are they going to fund their movement? Like, those will become the like these people that I think many black people and then people in general look up to. Like, who doesn't look up to Michael Jordan or Jay-Z? I mean, you don't even have to like Jay-Z's music to recognize what he did as a human being. I mean, he started. We could say he started where I started. He's just way better at it. Like, he's way better.
I mean, he picked a career that was more remunerative. Like,
And no,
you're a great teacher.
I started trying to go into rap, and I still think I'm a good rapper.
Jeremiah, this is actually what's going to get us canceled, which is in objectivism, rap is controversial. So the fact that we both love it.
You know what? Here's what's going to get us canceled, because where I was going to go with that next is every time I think about Jay-Z, I think of Gail Wyman. Because Jay-Z's not Gail Wyman, and I wouldn't necessarily put Beyonce in the Dominique.
Well, that's funny. Every time I think of you, I think of Gail Wyman. I was thinking about this the other day. You're this combination of Francisco and Gail Wyman in my mind, and that, like, you're good at just this insane, like, wide-ranging number of things, except for you didn't exactly have Francisco's child.
If only, man, right? But that's if I haven't read The Fountainhead in a while, and I should read it. There's so many books to read. But if you can look at, so Gail Wyman, just like Jay-Z, started from the bottom, started doing some very dubious stuff, ran with some gangs, did some stuff that was like, and he used that money to start an entertainment empire. And I've talked to people about this. It hasn't been controversial or anything. It's just kind of a thought that I've always had. It's like he started this. Jay-Z started Rockefeller. Wyman started his newspaper. I don't remember the newspaper off the top of my head. He started the newspaper, and then because of like their respective philosophies, they continued. They kind of became mixed at it, right? They were kind of like pro-capitalism so far as like they were concerned and making sure they were never poor again, but then also kind of feeling like the world wouldn't let them have it, or that like how would I put it? Like I don't know. All I'll say is the way that Jay-Z rapped early, he would say a lot of things that essentially amounted to, I'm not even. First of all, I'm not a rapper. I'm a businessman, right? Like, you've heard Jay-Z. He's like, I'm not a rapper. I'm a businessman. And he didn't even think he was the best rapper. He rapped the way he rapped because it made money, not because he felt like that was. He has this line that's like, if I can't remember the whole line, but it's like, lyrically, I would be Talib Kweli. Truthfully, I want to rhyme like common sense, but I made 5 million not rhyming like common sense. So, like, and that's the same thing with like Gail Wyman, where he has this notion of what he thinks should be in his newspapers. It's like, people don't buy newspapers for that, so I'm gonna sell them this. And so, I could run the parallels all day. The way
I mean, what it's going to come down to is if we ever hear about Beyonce getting a divorce and marrying an architect, we'll know that the story has run its full course.
And the thing is, as objectivist goes, if you don't see Jay-Z and Gail Wyman, then just expand your mind, man. Just listen to some Jay-Z.
All right, man. This has been a lot of fun. Everybody, check out the books. Jeremiah Cobra. Is it jeremiahcobra.com?
JeremiahCobra.com. I don't know why it took me so long to change my website to JeremiahCobra.com. It was everything else before. And it was everything else that was hard to spell. So it was like Obsidian Ink, and I had to spell Obsidian for people all the time. And it was Book of Adriel. Adriel's my middle name, but no one's ever heard that before, so I had to spell that. It's like just JeremiahCobra.com.
Awesome. All right. Take care.